Hello. So the reason for this screencast is to try and help you prepare for your test, your assessment on the character of Jekyll on Thursday. And the reason I'm doing it is because the last test you did, some people didn't seem to know how to prepare. And so if you remember, I've given you some things to look at, videos and links to websites on the class charts on your homework. So what I'm going to do is pretend to be you and try and talk you through how, if I were you, I would prepare myself for Thursday. So I know it's about Jekyll, and I have looked at class charts, excuse me, and I have found a GCSE pod. I've been advised to use that, so I've read that and I've made some notes. I also looked at the Mr. Bruff ones on Jekyll. There was also a website to look at, so I read that and I made some notes on all of that. And here they are. So let's have a look. These are the notes that I made. Now, the bits in red are because while I was looking at the Mr. Bruff one, I noticed that there was a context one, and I thought, oh, of course, I've got to talk about context as well. Now, it's context about the whole novella, not just Jekyll, but still, those are the bits in red. They're contexty things, and really they're all the context that I will need to know for any essay, so I've just made a few notes there. And I've also put that link now onto the class charts homework, so you'll be able to look at the context one as well. So that's what you do. You look at whatever the information you've got, whether it's notes in your book, whether it's videos or whatever you've been given, and you make some notes yourself. And amongst these notes, of course, I've got quotations that were on the videos and on the website as well. And then I'll be able to organize them. So first of all, I need to try and organize the stuff that I've got. And what I noticed when I was looking at the videos is that they talk about the presentation of Jekyll as a respectable Victorian gentleman and how that's done, and then the presentation of him as he becomes more towards the Hyde side of things, towards the evil and all that kind of thing. So I thought, well, I'll start with the idea of him being respectable and that presentation of him, and find what information I can about that. So how do I organize it? Well, I'll try and see what I've got on Jekyll as a respectable man, or how he's first introduced. So he's first introduced fairly early on, but it's through the story of the door and the connection made between him and Hyde through the will. And of course Utterson is all through from Utterson's point of view, and he's the lawyer, he has the will. And so straight away we're seeing this respectable man who is mixed up with this despicable man who treads and tramples on children. But when Utterson looks at the will, he finds that Hyde has more influence than Jekyll does, is more influential, is more powerful, because everything is going to be left to Hyde. So there's a first indication there of the something under the surface of this very respectable man which isn't quite right, and we don't know what it is yet. So that's the first thing about him. When later on he's described, we're given the letters after his name, and there's a string of letters which shows he's well educated, he's a respected doctor, we're told he's trusted and he's wealthy and he's respectable and he gives to charity. Now I need probably a quotation for that. I'll have to go back to that and think about that later, because I haven't got one really there for that. Later in the last chapter, when he tells us all about his story in the full statement of the case, we're told he was born to a large fortune. So he had every chance in life, and he's presented as this sort of perfect Victorian gentleman, or that was his upbringing at least, that he had everything going for him. He's certainly presented as a positive figure in the lives of others because he has friends of Lanyon and Hudson. There's a quotation here: he is intelligent, if you can read that, and reputable. We're told that he shows kindness, that's a quotation, and his first description of him is of a well-made, smooth-faced man. So there's something physically pleasing about him as well. So everything seems to be very positive about him in those times. But of course, all the time, the more negative things Stevenson is telling us about as well. For example, we discover that he has this fight, or has fallen out with Lanyon, and he describes Lanyon as an ignorant pedant. Now you can read that P-E-D-A-N-T, so and that's ... because I've missed a bit out of the quotation there. So he says that he's quite dismissive of Lanyon, and calling him ignorant pedant is really quite insulting. So there's something a bit unpleasant about Jekyll there. The other thing to say is when we first meet him, or first get to hear about him, it's because it's through Enfield or through Hudson that we start to learn about him through his friends rather than himself, which we don't really get to know him until the very last chapter when we have his viewpoint. So the fact that we learn about him through his friends makes him a bit more mysterious, and so perhaps he isn't as straightforwardly this perfect Victorian gentleman, because there's something mysterious about him, something secretive about him, because we don't quite, as readers, ever get to get inside his head, as it were, until the last chapter. We also find out later on, don't we, in the final chapter, that although he seems on the outside this perfect gentleman, he has this darker side, and he talks about certain unspecified indiscretions in his youth in the final chapter, and we're not really showed what they are. We're told he had a certain gaiety of disposition, meaning that he was to be gay would be to, in those days, would be to sort of have fun, be happy. And so he wasn't as he had always felt this need to enjoy himself, but when he did do whatever these indiscretions were, these bad things that he did, that's a bit vague, he always was left with a morbid sense of shame. And so there's this suggestion that perhaps this could be about sexuality, it could be about homosexuality. There's no proof of that, but the idea that perhaps there's the idea of something that in Victorian times was illegal and seen as shameful could be something that's in his makeup. And he talks about finding life difficult, and that as he got older he saw a profound duplicity of life. That life was, there was two sides to it. There was the side that he wanted to present to his to the public, and then there was his real desires and these bad intentions, whatever they were. So there are obviously two sides to him. There's the private side and the public side. I think I forgot to mention before this part here that in his row with Lanyon, he is described as too fanciful. And again, if you're fanciful, it means that you have kind of fancy ideas that, or like fantasy ideas, and therefore there is a sense in which Jekyll seems to be presented as somebody who's always had this rather too free private life and imagination that meant that he wanted to, or part of him wanted to, break out of the repressed Victorian society, middle class, upper middle class Victorian society that he was part of, and that's how he's presented. Then, as you know, you go through the novella, and Hyde becomes more powerful, and what Jekyll thought was going to be a successful scientific experiment turned bad, and this sense of freedom that he wanted became so intoxicating and almost like a drug that he couldn't stop taking. Well, it was a drug, he couldn't take him literally, wasn't it? But the feeling that it gave him when he became Hyde was so wonderful and so freeing that he became obsessed with it. So you get this obsessive need for this freedom, and then Hyde becomes gradually harder to control. And the interesting part, and the more, I suppose, perceptive points you might be thinking about, is the way in which, in the last chapter, he explains that when he turned to Hyde, he didn't turn. He turned to total evil. Hyde was the evil part within him. But when he was Jekyll, Hyde was still there. Hyde was in him. So Jekyll was a mixture of both good and evil, but Hyde was just the evil bit. And there's a part that was mentioned in the videos where this quotation here, had he approached his, in square brackets, discovery in a more noble spirit, meaning if his intentions had been good, if he had wanted to do good when he separated different parts of himself, then instead of a devil coming out in the form of Hyde, perhaps an angel would have come out. So what he's admitting is that actually he was he wanted to become Hyde. He wanted to have that freedom, and he wanted to indulge in these unspecified indiscretions, and he wanted to indulge his gaiety of disposition, and therefore he's not entirely innocent. He didn't just make a mistake. He wanted to be Hyde. He wanted to indulge his evil side, and he had bad intentions, and almost that he was looking for an excuse to let go and become, and allow his evil, his natural evil, to just flow. And indeed he says that at one point in the final chapter, when he talks about even before he started experimenting to try and separate good and evil, that he saw pleasure as a beloved daydream. So he would daydream about the idea of indulging in pleasure without any consequences. So that he talks about, in this part of the novel here, I had learned to dwell with pleasure as a beloved daydream on the thought of the separation of these elements. If each, I told myself, could be but housed in separate identities, life would be relieved of all that was unbearable. The unjust delivered from the aspirations might go his way, and the remorse of the more upright twin, and the just could walk steadfastly and securely on his upward path, doing the good things in which he found pleasure, and no longer exposed to disgrace and penitence by the hands of this extraneous evil. So what he's trying to do is have his cake and eat it. He's trying to have this pleasure that he feels he's morbidly ashamed of, but he wants to just get on with it and not have a conscience. He wants to not bother his more upright twin or his good side with the evil things that he gets up to. So his intentions therefore are not entirely honourable in any way. He is after being bad, basically. And as it goes on, of course, he sets up Hyde in an apartment, so he knows very well what he's doing, and he does that when he's Jekyll. He protects Hyde. He obviously leaves everything to him in his will, so he is culpable in this act. Therefore, the culpable meaning guilty. But he's like an addict. It's very much like somebody who can't stop achieving this wonderful pleasure. Once he's had it once, he has to have it again. And so the question that we're left with in terms of Jekyll is, well, as respectable Victorian gentlemen, should we repress our desires and therefore not allow Hyde out, just keep him under lock and key? Or should we, I suppose, let him out under a more kind of controlled, less repressed kind of way, and allow ourselves the pleasures that Jekyll seems to be desperate to conceal? And that's what brings you back to, why was he so ashamed of whatever it was that he did? And obviously that takes us into context and the idea of the respectable upper middle class gentleman having a sort of double life in reality rather than this fantasy novel, that middle class doctors, lawyers might have found the darker, seedier sides of the city, possibly in the East End of London, to perhaps meet prostitutes, drink, perhaps indulge in homosexual activity, which was illegal and a very serious offence. So that's where it takes you to context as well. Now, in terms of context, I'll change the colour here. What would be good? Green? Yeah, okay, let's try that. In one of the videos, I can't remember what it was, I think it was Mr. Bruff talks about this, a real scientist of the time called John Hunter, who became something of a celebrity and sort of experimented upon himself and did some rather bizarre experiments. And because at the time science was moving very quickly and technology was moving very quickly, the Victorians began to feel threatened by it a little and worried about the idea that, these mad scientists could possibly get out of control and cause terrible damage to society and perhaps the natural world. We have the same sort of fears now about technology and artificial intelligence taking over and things like that. So it's a very universal theme contextually, and obviously Jekyll is connected to that because Jekyll is this mad scientist, as it were, this scientist that uses his skill and knowledge to push the boundaries, whereas we have the opposite in Lanyon. There's somebody who's quite respectable who wants to or would dismiss this kind of science as nonsense and too fanciful. Also, in one of the videos it talks about these things called shilling shockers, which were a shilling, as you know, was a currency of the time, so you could buy these stories for a shilling, and they were aimed at the middle classes, at the doctors and lawyers and their wives, because most of the lower classes couldn't read, were illiterate. And so you can imagine, a middle class lady or gentleman sitting down with their shilling shocker and being fascinated by the lives that was depicted in these books and these stories, and the lives were of the lower classes being disgusting and vile and sexually promiscuous perhaps and violent, and they would have a sort of a morbid fascination with it and enjoy it and frighten themselves in the same way as we like to be frightened by a horror film or something. So these were all aimed at the upper classes, but they show the characters in them, the people in them, were all the lower classes. But in Jekyll and Hyde, Stevenson does something very different and actually shows us the middle classes, the upper classes, the middle upper classes, being mixed up with this seedier side of the city, the East End perhaps, where the East End of London, Soho, where Hyde lived in his flat, was where the poorer people live, and it was the West End where the richer people lived. So the monsters in these shilling shockers would be all the poor from the East End, but the monster in Jekyll and Hyde is actually inside respectable people. So Stevenson seems to be saying, well, you can't separate yourself from the poor. You are human as well, and you have these desires, even though you try to suppress them. The context obviously talks also about the growth of psychology or psychiatry, and the idea of the subconscious, which was a new idea, that there was a part of us in our subconscious mind, Freud came up with it, that we couldn't have access to, that there's things in there that are sometimes suppressed memories or something to do with the sexuality that we couldn't have access to consciously. And that was a terrifying idea for the Victorians at the time. So, and Jekyll seems to represent that, as he has inside him this part of him which he can't really control. and obviously your subconscious comes out in dreams, and Stevenson was very interested in dreams, and the idea that whatever you dream is actually sort of part of you, I suppose, could be a terrifying thing for some Victorians as well. And so it's an allegorical text, as was said in the videos, and which is almost like a parable. It has a moral, and perhaps Stevenson's talking about what happens when if you are Jekyll, and somebody like Jekyll, and you give in to that darker side. That need for pleasure can be so overwhelming that you can't give it up, almost like a drug addict or an alcoholic or something like that. Also, in terms of context, you've got the class threat. So the idea being that the upper classes, the middle classes, were threatened by the lower classes, or they felt threatened because cities were growing massively quickly. People were pouring into cities for work, for the industry, and to work in factories and mines and things, and so they were all living right on top of each other, and the Victorians began to get a bit panicky, the middle classes, and they felt threatened by the darker, seedier side of the city, both threatened and fascinated. And therefore, in a sense, Stevenson is holding up a mirror to Victorian society and saying, look, you are just as capable as evil as anybody else, and you have these desires that Jekyll talks about. So we've got lots of ideas, we've sorted through, we understand how the characters presented, we understand the writer's intentions, what the character's for. So now we need to try and boil it all down so that we can actually learn some things and organise what we've thought. So if we start off with the sort of respectable presentation of him, so we know that he's presented as very respectable Victorian doctor, and we got some quotations now to back that up, which I've found. So Enfield, in The Story of the Door, it talks about him without naming him as someone who is in the very pink of the properties, which means somebody who is the most respectable sort of person, probably be worth learning. Most respectable, or the kind of gold standard, the highest standard of person. Okay. Celebrated, so he's a celebrated person, a well-known person, but in a good way in the community. And he says what makes matters worse is one of your fellows who do what they call good. So he does good. He does what they call good. He's a do-gooder. He gives to charity, etc. That's what that means. All right. So we've got this point about the fact that when we first introduced him, we're told that the list of the letters after his name to show he's well educated. We've also the description of him. He's described as having kindness about him, or his face shows kindness. His face is also described as a well-made, smooth-faced, with something of a slyish cast, perhaps. Now that's something about it. But so all this stuff is positive. We'll come back to the other bits in a minute. Now, Jekyll himself says in the last chapter that he had this wonderful upbringing, and he had every guarantee of an honourable and distinguished future. So that's what he wanted. That's what the Victorians were after. The middle classes, they wanted to be seen as honourable, and distinguished means I don't know, successful, I suppose. And that he says that he was inclined by nature to industry, so he was naturally industrious, which means he worked hard, and he was fond of respect, so he wanted to be respected. He was fond of the respect of the wise and the good. So all of this sort of idea presents the character as this sort of perfect Victorian gentleman. But even here there are some things to think about which may not be so positive. So we've got, we've got things like he had this smooth face, so this all is very good, but with something of a slyish cast, perhaps. It's a funny colour. A slyish cast, perhaps, meaning there's something. A cast is a slight turn in your eye, so that not quite a squint, but a very slight suggestion that one eye isn't quite in line with the other. And it's described as slyish. Now, if you're sly, that means you're not quite honest. So there's something there that's slightly negative about him. And also, this idea of being smooth-faced. Now, you could say that just means he's got a nice complexion, but the idea of being a bit too smooth, a bit too plausible, almost like a salesman, so that he's giving you this very smooth exterior, and perhaps underneath there's something less smooth. And it's interesting that later, here, when they go to the Hyde's flat, and the landlady, who is this really unpleasant character, is described as having an evil face smoothed by hypocrisy. Again, smoothed, and we get that same idea there. So that Stevenson obviously uses that word when describing people's faces to mean something a bit dishonest. And if you are a hypocrite, then you pretend to be something that you're not. You say one thing and do another, which, when you look at that, you can see that the writer could be describing something about Jekyll here that's not very pleasant. Everything else, though, these quotations here are all to show the idea of him being seen as this celebrated do-gooder, and him himself wanting to be this person who is good and wise and respected and honourable, all those words there. So that's something to start with in terms of how he's presented. So moving on from there, we've got how he's presented in these positive ways with some little hints of some negativity, but then there are other things we can talk about in terms of the other side of him. So first thing to say, a useful thing to think about, is that we learn about him, as I said before, through other characters until we get to chapter 3. So we have two whole chapters where we hear about him. We hear about his relationship to Hyde, or possible relationship to Hyde. We hear about all these awful things Hyde does, and we hear of the will and Utson's worries about him. So there's already this very dark mystery surrounding him. It gives the readers some cause to see him in this mysterious light, and we're a bit suspicious of him even then. Now then we hear through the novel about his fight with Lanyon, and Jekyll, in the chapter Dr. Jekyll Was Quite at Ease, is quite scathing of Lanyon. He calls him an ignorant pedant, and then later Lanyon describes Jekyll as too fanciful and wrong in mind. And so there's something negative about this, that the strong feelings of sort of hatred between these two, which again puts Jekyll in perhaps a not so positive light. And later on, all these are from the last chapter, where we learn about him most. We learn about his certain unspecified indiscretions of youth, whatever these crimes or misdemeanors were that he got up to when he was younger. We've talked about this gaiative disposition, the shame that he felt, the way he concealed his pleasures, and the way he saw pleasure as a beloved daydream that he used to imagine being able to separate good and evil, so he didn't have to have a conscience and he didn't have to worry about what he did. And also that point about he had approached his discovery, and approached his discovery in a more noble spirit, then perhaps something noble would have come out of it. Perhaps an angel would have appeared, as opposed to this devil, this demon that was released when Hyde came out. And that, of course, if you remember, is about his intentions. When he was doing his experiments, what was behind his intentions? Was he actually trying to do good, or was he actually just trying to get away with doing bad? And this seems to suggest that he at the end he realizes that his intentions were not good. So that we've got now two sides to him. We've got the side that people see and people think the people who think they know him, and that side, the sort of positive side. But then we've also got, we learn as we go through the book, with hints all the time, but then certainly at the end, what he was like actually. And actually he was this sort of tortured soul who couldn't control the devil within him. So now finally we need to think about context and what we're going to say. How can we link any contextual ideas to this character? And as I said before, there's a few things to think about in terms of how he comes across. The first thing to think about is how there was this class divide at the time, and so the middle classes, or sorry, the upper classes, were beginning to be worried about the lower classes as they poured into cities, and cities became had these areas like Soho that were sort of slums, and there was lots of crime and things like that, and the upper classes were concerned about that. But also they were concerned, but also there was a kind of fascination. And I think we're all slightly fascinated with the seedier side of life, the less respectable side of life, and certainly Victorians were no different. And so, and this is quite a good one to use, as we said before, this idea of these magazines, or these stories that were sold in these magazines called shilling shockers, and they were these kind of horror stories, and the perpetrators of the crimes, the sort of criminals, the bad people, were always from the lower classes. But in Jekyll and Hyde, the writer decides to have the evil, or the criminal side, the actual evil is actually in the respectable upper class gentleman. You can relate to Jekyll as a character because he was the epitome, or was supposed to be, of this respectability, but he was anything but on the inside. And so there was a criticism there, or an exploration at least, of the nature of humanity, and perhaps a criticism of Victorian mindset of repression. And that would be a slightly uncomfortable read for the Victorian middle classes to basically have Stevenson say, well, this is you who are is the wife of a respected doctor, or the doctor himself. I'm he was kind of having a little dig at them and their own hypocrisies and their obsession with respectability and being noble and good in a sense, and all those sorts of things, when actually underneath there was other things going on. So that's how Jekyll sort of represents those sort of people. He also represents this idea of the sort of mad scientist, if you can put it that way, or the scientist that is pushing the boundaries, and is therefore Jekyll is a kind of symbol of the scientific and technological revolution that was going on at the time. Unlike any revolution, it leaves people feeling uncertain and worried. So that was something else that is explored through the character of Jekyll, who is, if you remember, supremely confident to begin with, and he says, doesn't he, that to what's his name, to Utterson, he assures him that he can be rid of Hyde any time, that he can, when he talks about the will to him, it says he can be rid of Hyde in a stroke, in a moment. So that overconfidence, it leads to his downfall because he doesn't realise what he's messing with, and so he's opened a door scientifically that he can't close. And that idea, if you think about it, is a very current one. The idea of, say, they say this, once we get to some tipping point with artificial intelligence, some people say that the machines will take over and that kind of stuff. So you can always relate context to modern day thoughts as well, and you can talk about how the novel has a universal application or universal themes that it deals with when you think about context. Also, as we mentioned before, the idea of science, but also the growth of psychology or psychiatry, and the idea of the discovery of the subconscious, and that this part of the brain that we don't have access to. And that Jekyll, in this case, he seems to release the subconscious, and the subconscious entity that comes out is Hyde. And so the suggestion seems to be that in our subconsciouses, and in the subconsciouses of the Victorian middle classes, there lurks a Hyde, and that is something that we have no access to again. So those two things were sort of scary, but what the writer's doing is he's tapping into, and I think that's a useful phrase, that he's sort of tapping into the fears and the sort of nightmares, as it were, of that would haunt the Victorians. The things that, when they think of the world, a sense of their world being out of control, and things moving too quickly for them, in terms of science and technology and things, and the idea of this part of the mind that you can't have access to is just too scary. But a good writer, a good horror writer, over the years, all horror writers tap into and find whatever it is in the consciousness of the society of the time, and they know then that, right, once I've got this, I'll be able to frighten the reader. And the whole point is, because this is Gothic horror, that we're frightened by it, or the Victorians at least were. So what that gives you then is just a guide onto how to prepare. So now you've got all the key ideas that go to make up this character and his role in the novel, and the ideas behind him as a character and how it relates to Victorian society. So your next job then is to learn these quotations, learn them as well as you can, and as I've said before, just single words are fine, and if sometimes you try and learn a longer quotation and you don't quite get it right, you might get a word mixed up or something, it would not be the end of the world. And also, if you don't have a quotation for something, you can just make reference to what was going on or what sort of thing was said, and that will do. But it's probably best to try and get a few of these quotations in your brains, as I've asked you to, by Tuesday. And then you need to obviously look at the book and find those sections where Jekyll is most prevalent, or is talked about. So obviously the final chapter is important, but any other parts where Jekyll appears, Dr. Jekyll is quite at ease, that chapter, that sort of thing, the incident at the window, you need to look through all those things and think, well, what possible section might come up in the test and the exam, and make sure that you understand those bits, and you know what the words mean, and you might even look at some of the language uses and things like that. But you have here the outline for understanding the character and being well prepared for the assessment. And obviously if you do a good job, then you're in a much better position to sit your final exams. So best of luck with it, and you can do your test on Thursday. Jolly good. Bye bye. So your next job then is to learn these quotations, learn them as well as you can, and as I've said before, just single words are fine, and if sometimes you try and learn a longer quotation and you don't quite get it right, you might get a word mixed up or something, it would not be the end of the world. And also, if you don't have a quotation for something, you can just make reference to what was going on or what sort of thing was said, and that will do. But it's probably best to try and get a few of these quotations in your brains, as I've asked you to, by Tuesday. And then you need to obviously look at the book and find those sections where Jekyll is most prevalent, or is talked about. So obviously the final chapter is important, but any other parts where Jekyll is appears, Dr. Jekyll is quite at ease, that chapter, that sort of thing, the incident at the window, you need to look through all those things and think, well, what possible section might come up in the test and the exam, and make sure that you understand those bits and you know what the words mean, and you might even look at some of the language uses and things like that. But you have here the outline for understanding the character and being well prepared for the assessment. And obviously if you do a good job, then you're in a much better position to sit your final exams. So best of luck with it, and you can do your test on Thursday. Jolly good. Bye bye.